good afternoon, and welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials Educational Webinar Series. My name is Brian Gilbert, the Deputy Director of Events here at NCIA, and as always, I'm very excited to welcome you all to the return of our Policy Council Conversation series of programs this afternoon. Now, let's get this show on the road. In today's program, join the 6 primary authors of NCIA's recently released white paper on the medicinal aspects of cannabis for an overview designed to help inform and guide policymakers as well as medical professionals on the science, history, and uses of medical cannabis. In today's webinar, our panel of physicians, veterinarians, and PhD researchers will discuss their paper and summarize what your doctor and policymaker needs to know to help inform their decision-making process. We'll review the different conditions cannabis can treat alongside the research that backs it up, while discussing associated policy implications for cannabis, including the need to deschedule. I hope you've all had the chance to review the publication prior to this program. However, if you haven't, don't worry, as we'll be dropping links to download directly throughout the conversation inside the chat room, and you'll all receive a PDF version of the publication directly in an email sent after our broadcast wraps up. Well, I know our panel is eager to dive into this discussion, and our audience members are interested in having all their questions answered along the way. So let's not waste any more time. To kick things off, I'd like to welcome back our moderator for today's session, Paloma Layfeld, Director of Medical Education at Vireo Health, to the virtual stage. She'll be kicking things off today by introducing our panel of medical cannabis experts. Welcome to NCIA's Industry Essentials, Paloma. Great to have you back today. How are you doing?
I am doing awesome, Brian. I couldn't be more excited to be doing a webinar on this paper. It's incredibly timely. I just really want to thank NCIA, the Policy Council, Brian, always a pleasure working with you, Andrew Klein, and the rest of the NCIA's members. For all of you who haven't downloaded the paper, it'll be in the chat link. Today, the purpose is really just to go over a primer for the paper if you haven't had a chance to read it. We'll also go through the history of cannabis, medical uses of cannabis, current research in cannabis, as well as our policy recommendation. If anything, pay attention to the end. We'll make sure to summarize it for you as best we can. Interact with us, ask us questions throughout. We're excited to hear from you. So my name is Dr. Paloma Layfeld. I am one of the 3 physicians on the paper. I currently am the Director of Medical Education at Vireo Health, a physician-founded, physician-led company. I have been a lifelong cannabis advocate and student, much the chagrin of my undergraduate neuroscience professor. I wrote my honors thesis on THC and have continued studying cannabis as a supplement to my education, and I'm thrilled to be here. Next up, we have Dr. Stephen M. Dahmer. He's a board-certified family physician whose passion for health and healing has taken him around the globe. A fellow of the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine for over 2 decades, he has studied the relationship between plants and people, working closely with diverse cultures and documenting their uses of plants and other integrative therapies. Since 2015, Dr. Dahmer has served as Chief Medical Officer of Vireo Health, a physician-founded, patient-focused company dedicated to providing best-in-class manufacture and clinical utilization of cannabinoid-based therapies. For Vireo Health, he oversees clinical research partnerships, pharmacovigilance, physician outreach and engagement, and over 200 employees providing education, support, awareness, and a compassionate patient experience to over 100,000 unique patients utilizing medical cannabis. Dr. Dahmer has given over 200 lectures on cannabinoid-related medical topics and is involved in 2 large-scale clinical trials studying medical cannabis, opioids, and chronic pain. Dr. Dahmer is also the Assistant Clinical Professor of Family Medicine and Community Health at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and Director of Holistic Primary Care practicing Integrative Family Medicine in Scarsdale, New York. Welcome to the show, Dr. Dahmer.
Such an intro. Thank you, Dr. Paloma. Amazing honor to be here with this incredible and hardworking group. I mean, what a crew to put together this white paper, and thank you, NCIA, for this platform. Can't wait to jump in and discuss what, as you mentioned, such a timely, such a poignant, such a important topic, and just hungry to get to the meat of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, we have our sole wonderful PhD on the paper, Dr. Paul Machowski. Dr. Paul Machowski is the CEO of Defined Research, a cannabis company that operates at the intersection of cannabis and technology. Prior to entering the cannabis industry, he taught as a professor in the medical schools at the University of Washington and the University of California, San Francisco. Paul has a PhD in biological structure and has published more than 60 highly cited papers in peer-reviewed journals. Welcome, Paul Machowski. How are we doing?
Great, thank you. Really happy to be here. And yeah, it's fun to finally see the culmination of all our hard work on this project and get a chance to share it with the broader community here. So really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Brian just added some links on the side for all of our affiliations. Check them out before or after. We'd love to interact with you. Next up, we have my good friend and colleague, Dr. Lynn Porodnik. Dr. Lynn Porodnik, MD, is a doctor with over 20 years of experience, educated at Sarah Lawrence College and New York Medical College. She trained in obstetrics and gynecology and formed a private practice on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. In recent years, she made a major career transition to community-based medicine as a full-time medical marijuana practitioner. She operates a sole practice out of her residence in northern Westchester, where she has lived since 1989 and raised her two sons. With over 500 active patients, she is one of the leading medical marijuana clinicians in New York, with numerous referring specialists and an extensive professional network in the cannabis industry. She is an advocate for education on medical marijuana use and the expansion of New York's compassionate care program. It has been interviewed on NPR multiple times. Her speaking engagements have included the Westchester Psychological Association, Westchester County Senior Alliance, as well as numerous private clubs, assisted living communities, and public libraries in New York State. Welcome, Dr. Porodnik.
Thanks, Paloma, and thank you everybody for being here. We have a lot of good information to share, and I'm really excited to finally be able to sit down, see everybody, and do this. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now to get into our amazing veterinarians, we had to really differentiate between saying vets and veterinarians on this paper as we talk about PTSD and some other illnesses that affect our vets disproportionately. But up first is Dr. Tim Hsu, a veterinarian and the founder and CEO of Vet CBD. Dr. Hsu's passion is the integration of cannabinoid therapeutics into veterinary medicine. Welcome, Dr. Hsu, to the show.
Thanks, Dr. Layfeld. Happy to be here. And thank you, NCIA, for putting this together.
And last, but definitely not least, we have Dr. Casara Andre. Dr. Casara Andre is the founder of Veterinary Cannabis Education and Consulting. Casara Andre, DVM and CVMA, is dedicated to providing practical education and harm reduction training to the emerging veterinary cannabis field. Dr. Andre firmly believes that scientific curiosity can and will open unexpected, exciting, and hugely beneficial opportunities within this field, but also their scientific rigor and scrutiny must never be neglected. Dr. Andre also serves the veterinary community as the owner of Cultivate, a veterinary co-working community, the director of the Colorado School of Animal Massage, the president of Care for the Healer, and the co-coordinator for Colorado's Veterinary Medical Reserve Corps. Welcome, Dr. Andre. Happy to have the crew back together again.
Hi, everybody. Yes, it's so lovely to see all of your faces. And as Lynn said, finally be at this point to actually disseminate some information rather than those long hours of writing on this document. We are so excited to interact with all of you and for Tim and I to be able to talk about patients of all species, not just the humankind. Thank you.
Happy as well. So that's our panel. Again, really excited. We worked on this for a very long time and happy to finally be talking about it. Please interact with us. We have 6 of us here, so some of us can be answering questions while the others are talking. If you have something that comes up, please interact with us. So we're going to start this panel talking about the history of cannabis, and we included this in our paper for a very important reason. A lot of us in our careers speak with other healthcare providers about the benefits of cannabis, and that's because a lot of them come to us and say, okay, if this is such is amazing, adjunct therapy or alternative therapy, why weren't we taught about it in our doctorate programs, in veterinary school, and in medical school? And that's because of the really deplorable history in the United States of cannabis. A lot of people don't know that prior to the so-called war on drugs on Black and brown communities, cannabis was an integral part of American economy, and not just medical cannabis. Cannabis was used on sails on our ships. It was used to make clothes. It was a major export in the United States. And that all started to change when we saw the Mexican Revolution in 1910, where we first saw the recreational use of cannabis. And that's why you won't really hear us very often using the word marijuana, because it really has a negative and xenophobic connotation that was really used with Mexican immigrants. After that, in 1937 was with the Marijuana Tax Act, which successfully criminalized cannabis in the United States. And after that, unfortunately, the rest is history. Cannabis in 1960s was added to the Controlled Substance Act and has remained a Schedule I substance since. A lot of people also don't realize that in 1850, cannabis was in the United States Pharmacopoeia, which is the Bible for healthcare providers prior to, and still remains so today. It was used to treat opiate addiction, leprosy, sexual dysfunction, many of the conditions that we see today where medical cannabis and cannabis recreationally is still being used. So again, we as the authors of this paper really felt passionate of the fact that we had to bring up to policymakers and to fellow physicians and veterinarians and everybody reading that the only reason that cannabis isn't available to patients, and all of our patients today isn't available for good research, is because of this very racist, xenophobic, and antiquated legislation that remains today in 2021. So that's really why we felt that it was necessary to bring it into this paper. And we'll come back to the history again as we go through some of our policy recommendations throughout. So before we do that, we're going to kind of talk about the physiology of cannabis and why it's so important. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kasara Andre. And Kasara, can you tell us about exactly what the ECS is and why it's so important?
Yes, absolutely. Although if I was really to go into as much detail as I'd love to, it really would be 12 hours. I mean, there is so much that we already know about the ECS that fills hours and hours worth of lectures, and just now there's starting to be textbooks written, but we still are just scratching the surface, I think, of what this system has to teach us. I will say that in my career, there has never been a science, a field of area of medicine that I have loved working with more than the ECS. So as everyone, maybe you're getting used to cannabis and ECS and what is all this terminology, I will just say the star of the show is truly the endocannabinoid system. Cannabis is very cool for many, many reasons, but mostly because it works on this fabulous system that is within all mammals, for sure, definitely within most all vertebrates, but for sure the mammals. So for me as a veterinarian, when I think about what is this ECS, I really look at it as this very encompassing regulatory system for complex biologic organisms. So most of you will probably be familiar with the word homeostasis, or essentially balance within an organism's body. The endocannabinoid system is responsible for that. It is responsible for making sure that that entire biologic organism is working well within itself. So we think about function in sleep, memory, learning, social interactions. And as practitioners, we're not often working on systems that have all those implications. We deal with sleep that's dysregulated or appetite that's not working quite as well. But when we look at endocannabinoid system as something that we can actually modify clinically, it opens so many doors for us to be able to really hone and define and hopefully move our patients towards a better well-being. So Paloma, that's what I have to share in terms of what is the ECS. Could go into so much more detail than that. But I think for our audience of both policymakers and practitioners, thinking about the ECS as a widespread regulatory mechanism that really maintains homeostasis, you would hit the nail on the head with that one.
Excellent synopsis. And we do have more in the paper. You can download it in the chat on the right. And the next question is for Dr. Tim Hsu. Tim, tell us about some ways the ECS works in different mammalian disease processes throughout the body.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is that the ECS is not just a system that's isolated. It's deeply intertwined with all other physiological systems. So whether it's the cardiovascular system, the nervous system, or the musculoskeletal system, the ECS plays a regulatory role and is intertwined with all of those other systems. So there is a interesting line of thought that whenever we are dealing with the disease process, the ECS is in some form or fashion to some degree involved. There's also some other interesting things that are out there. For example, some people talk about clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. Our own bodies produce cannabinoids. So, anandamide and 2-AG are the two most well known, but I think we're up to like something like 6 or 7 different endocannabinoids. And so there is a line of thinking that if our body is not adequately producing enough of these endocannabinoids, if we have low endocannabinoid tone, for example, it could lead to certain disease processes. For example, the ones that have been talked about are fibromyalgia, migraines, and IBS. Because what's been found is that when those patients are supplemented with exogenous cannabinoids from phytocannabinoids, that their symptoms improve. We see this in all other aspects. For example, either low hormone levels or low thyroid levels, and so it makes sense that potentially there are some patients that have decreased circulating levels or endogenous tone of cannabinoids. We certainly know that we've seen the opposite to be true too. There is a woman out in the UK that has high levels of endocannabinoid tone. Because of a genetic defect, I guess, in one of her enzymes that normally breaks down anandamide. So she doesn't feel fear or anxiety, and she has decreased pain sensation. We also know that there's CB receptor polymorphisms. We've seen this in humans. No reason to think that it doesn't exist in animals as well. And what's interesting is that genetic differences in the way, for example, the CB1 receptor is encoded may be associated with certain psychiatric disorders. So for example, ADHD or PTSD or addiction. And then genetic changes in the CB2 receptor could potentially be associated with certain immune disorders like autoimmune disorders or certain bone density issues. So that's what's really fascinating about this is that we're really at the tip of the iceberg in terms of understanding the role that the ECS plays and the role that it plays in health and disease, and that it's not just in humans, but because we know that all vertebrae and even some invertebrate have endocannabinoid systems. The impact of the endocannabinoid system on health and disease is something that's going to play a huge role in clinical practice.
Excellent. And just to give the audience an idea, for those of us who were not taught about the ECS in our doctorate studies, raise your hand. We're not. Thanks, Paul. Okay, so again, a very small amount of doctorate or any kind of school really teaches about this. And we just heard from Dr. Shu and Dr. Andre how imperative and important it is to regulate the balance in our body. So Tim and Kasara, do most of your veterinary colleagues actually know about the ECS and the diseases in which it is responsible for or able to treat?
Paloma, I'd say that the awareness is growing, and I think it's lagging slightly behind the human side of medicine simply because some of the policies are a little bit more restrictive on the veterinary side and just awareness pieces. However, in our clinical practice, it is usually the pet owner, the animal caregiver who's asking us about cannabis. So usually our questions are focusing more on cannabis plant because that's what they're hearing in the media. But as practitioners, we really have to understand what those molecules are going to do to the ECS. So I would say it's growing, but just as you saw from all of our hands here, it's only just now beginning to be included in doctoral studies. And so it's just getting out and there into the mainstream education. So majority of our colleagues, I would think, know, not with a comfort level in practice. I think that would be more rare to find, but I think everyone's very interested.
Yeah, I think it's the comparison that I always make is you can imagine if you went into your physician or your veterinarian and you asked them about the endocrine system and the role that hormones play in health and disease, and, what things like testosterone and estrogen are and what they're responsible for. Imagine if they said, I don't know anything about hormones. I don't know anything about the endocrine system. You would think that's pretty crazy. But that's actually where we're at today. Is most of the time when you walk into your doctor's office or your veterinarian's office and you ask about the endocannabinoid system, the endocannabinoids and the role that they play in health and disease, 99+% of the time you're going to get, I don't know, or I don't feel comfortable talking to you about that. And we're still seeing in schools that it's barely touched on. I've recently asked at some veterinary schools, and it's barely touched on, if at all.
Excellent. And for the sake of time, let's move from the endogenous cannabinoid system to the exogenous cannabinoid system to phytocannabinoids, just a fancy way to say plant medicine in the cannabis plant. Let's circle back to you again, Tim. Let's talk about the cannabis plant. What are the difference between major and minor cannabinoids?
Yeah, so, Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, the godfather of cannabis research, has called this plant a pharmacological treasure trove, and with good reason. We know that there's over 500 different compounds that come from the cannabis plant. We've identified a large number of them, but we really haven't studied that many of them. THC and CBD are considered the major cannabinoids, and that's primarily because of their accessibility and their abundance. They're found in the largest quantity in the plant, and so they're easily accessible and easy to study. But there are a lot of other cannabinoids that are present too, so CBC, CBG, CBN, there's CBDV, THCV, and we really don't have much information about these cannabinoids. Any clinical studies are very far and few in between. So it remains to be seen how we can use these other cannabinoids beneficially. And we're seeing rapid progression in terms of the industry making these cannabinoids available.
Certainly. And because we don't have good clinical research, we often rely on anecdotes and some of our medical cannabis practitioners, such as Dr. Lynn Porodnik. Dr. Porodnik, which minor cannabinoids have you found to be particularly efficacious in your patients? Perhaps you can share a story about one that worked particularly well.
Well, I have had, you can hear me, correct? A lot of success with CBN. As far as a minor cannabinoid, CBN seems to be really helpful for sleep. And a lot of times we worry about with seniors, psychoactivity, by working with, and also with children. So by subbing in some CBN, we can get people to sleep comfortably and decrease the amount of THC that you're using. My favorite story is actually about a 24-year-old boy who was on the spectrum. He was not verbal. He had toilet issues, we will say, but the biggest problem for the family was food issues. When they would go to a restaurant, he'd grab food from every table. When they'd go to the supermarket, he'd go through open chips. The bill would be $300 to $400. So they basically came to me for impulse control. So with him, we worked with CBD dominant, and then for transition times, a 1-to-1 CBD THC formulation. We started slow, worked our way up, and after 3 months, he was able to live in a group, move to a group home and be compliant. After 6 months, I did a follow-up visit with him, and he wrote on his iPad, "Please tell people this really helps." Now, this is a boy who's supposed to have no introspection, no empathy, but he gets it. He understands that this medication is the difference for him between having a real life and living at home with his parents. He now has a part-time job at the group home. Things got a little hectic with COVID. When things really accelerate, he works with his 1-to-1. He's able to verbalize green, because that's the color of his medication, and he does well. So for me, that was a real eye-opener. Somebody who can't even talk can feel the difference and that this is working, and he understands the difference it makes in his life. He's able to live with other kids now. He doesn't have to be with his parents.
Thank you for sharing that. That story touches me every time. And Dr. Lynn has seen many patients and really has seen firsthand the medicinal benefits of cannabis, as have our other cannabis practitioners on the webinar today. And really quick, I'm just going to do a roundtable everyone can go around and kind of say their favorite cannabinoid or terpene. Terpenes are substances not just in the cannabis plant. You can find them in other botanicals, such as linalool, which is lavender, which we know people have used to relax for thousands and thousands of years. I'll go ahead and start. I'm going to go to the major cannabinoids, CBD, which I've really seen in clinical research and anecdotal evidence to really help a bevy of different mental health conditions, including anxiety and PTSD. I will kick it to Dr. Paul.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna go with one of the terpenes, and I particularly like linalool as well, actually, which you mentioned. The terpenes I think are something that are completely underappreciated from the medical side. I think consumers are aware that the terpenes are involved in the entourage effect and are influencing physiology, but they haven't been studied so much at the human level in clinical trials, and I think that's an area that will be exciting to go into.
Sure. Dr. Dahmer.
I like this fun game to go around. I'm not going past THC, Delta 9. It's, again, maybe a boring answer, but we just still don't even understand it. There's just so much to learn about it. We're jumping into these many levels, which I'm passionate about, Dr. Paloma, but THC, just what a versatile, amazing, constituent if we can understand that. And I like pining. Big fan of pine trees. I like my coffee. I like to be on point and a little bit more alert. And as you know, just finished a great book, The Nature Fix, and the tremendous power of these chemicals and how they influence our physiology. And agree with Dr. Paul, 110%, just incredibly underutilized. And this is the third layer to this amazing plant.
It's like picking a favorite child. You just can't do it. Dr. Andre?
I would say cannabidiolic acid, so CBDA for me. We struggle so much with pain control in our animals because they are so stoic, and often it's very hard to identify pain when they're really trying to not let us know that they're painful. We've seen some amazing success using that in a lot of cases that we just could not make headway in. And along the same lines for the terpene side, I'd say beta-caryophyllene. We've made some great progress on immune system disorders that we had no idea what's going on, to see some really, really amazing results there.
Thank you. Dr. Shu?
Yeah, I think the default answer for veterinary patients would probably be CBD, but I'm going to have to go with THC. THC gets a bad rep, and even amongst the veterinary community, a lot of veterinarians are under the misinformed opinion that THC is somehow poisonous, and THC does have medicinal benefits, even in veterinary patients. It's really about using the dose and the formulation. And so, THC has traditionally been up against a lot of propaganda, negative opinion. On the human side, we're seeing that shift rapidly. But in the veterinary space, it's still up against a lot. And my goal and my hope is to see that perspective shift, just like how we have in the human space.
And Dr. Parodnik, I know you mentioned CBN, but any other favorites?
Yeah, THCV. It's amazing for focus, sit down, get your stuff done. And I find it really interesting because it's also been used for weight loss. So I have a few patients with ADD who really find it helpful before they sit down to do their work. They're using their THCV. One of the terpenes I most like is the limonene. A lemon I find to be really refreshing, uplifting. And since I've been a little kid, I've always loved lemons, lemonade. And until I became a pot doctor, I didn't understand why. But now I get it. It's really helpful for depression and uplifting spirits.
Thank you. And thank you, all the participants and attendees. I'm seeing your Mersines in the chat box, and I agree with the Mersine as well. Okay, so next section of the paper, we're going to talk a little bit about the clinical uses of cannabis. We broke it down by disease in the paper. So really you can go and show your healthcare provider what if you suffer from a particular ailment. We have it broken down so you can really show the clinical research about the disease to them if, like most of us, they weren't taught about cannabis. in medical school or veterinary school. So to start, Paul, what diseases have you seen that really benefit from cannabis? How is the research you're doing potentially going to benefit people in the future?
Thank you, Paloma. Yeah, so I mean, I would like to first just start by mentioning that, there's always in the public some perception of like, does cannabis really work for anything medically, or misperception that it doesn't work for things. And in fact, the National Academy of Scientists, a group of the most prestigious scientists in the US, did a very thorough investigation of this and showed, essentially after reviewing all the scientific studies that have been published, that there's unequivocally compelling evidence that cannabis or components of cannabis effectively treat multiple things, including pain, nausea associated with chemotherapy, and there was moderate evidence also that it would support things like anxiety and insomnia. So those are ones that we already have compelling evidence on, and yet it's not yet widely accepted as such. But there's actually, a lot of other disease states that, there's some evidence that it might have some efficacy there that we're exploring right now. My personal favorite example of medical effects of components of cannabis is CBD. So CBD is the active ingredient in Epidiolex, which is a drug that is used to treat children with severe forms of epilepsy and syndromes called Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome. And this went all the way through phase 3 clinical trials and was approved by the FDA. And tens of thousands of children are taking this and are effectively being treated with CBD. So I think that's probably the best example of a very compelling effect of a component of cannabis. So yeah, and my company is really interested in sort of exploring new areas where components of cannabis might work in certain disease states, but we don't have that compelling, rigorous clinical placebo-controlled randomized studies. And in the short term, we're really interested in insomnia. So that's what we've been focusing on.
Lots of people suffering from insomnia right now after this global pandemic. We're seeing new onset of mental illness. And again, the benefit of cannabis is insurmountable, especially now. Speaking of research, Dr. Dahmer, can you talk to us about why is research even important for cannabis, and a little bit about the research that you're doing?
Absolutely. Thanks, Paloma. When I first got into cannabis, and despite kind of a history in my career of studying medicinal plants, I was guilty of what we all raised our hand for. Knew nothing about what was called marijuana at the time, and honestly, had a stigma in my own mind associated with the plant that I didn't even admit to, just by negligence of studying many other medicinal plants, but ignoring this one. And, again, when I began kind of my career, or my second career in cannabis, in addition to the clinical work, the first thing that we always do as physicians is let's look at the literature and see what exists. And I came over and over and over again across a line that just started to irk me and still does this to this day, that says more research is needed. And I guarantee anybody that peruses the literature and looks at the studies is going to come across this same line. The other thing that really caught my attention is that, some of the research at that time, and it's a little bit outdated now, but estimates that upwards of 35 million Americans are regularly using cannabis. That rivals our top prescription medications. So here we have a substance that's really rivaling our top prescription medications in the United States, that we have these amazing anecdotes that as I got more and more into the industry, just like Dr. Lynn was speaking to, so many of these incredible stories where this homeostatic supermodulatory system engaged by this plant helped to overcome a symptom or symptoms related to a disease or other problems. And yet we could not do the research that was needed to support this. And the other thing that I think outlined very clearly in this paper is this is not our typical drug substance. This is incredibly different from our usual pharmaceuticals that we write prescriptions for as doctors. And we oftentimes quote that this is the plant of 1,001 molecules. The plant is so incredibly complex, coming in different variations, and then working on the complexity of the endocannabinoid system, which just makes research near impossible as it is, makes it very difficult. And, you know, I think for all of us, one of the main reasons to put together this paper is that to have huge barricades that block even attempts at understanding better this plant and this system, as is currently the reality in the United States, is just a huge disservice. And, you know, I would even argue a potential harm to all of the Americans, many of them in state legal programs today, utilizing this plant. And we need to focus, you know, that kind of restriction that has been on freedom and the war on drugs to really getting better answers for those that are using this tool that was given to us by nature. And that's, again, what kind of the impetus is, to get better answers. And to delve quickly, you know, again, so many people are doing incredible research despite these obstacles, despite a near impossible field to do high quality research with products that people are actually using in the United States. So many people are doing incredible research. I do want to give some credit, and we are lucky enough to work with them on this, as Montefiore and Albert Einstein, in terms of 2 large-scale clinical trials. One is a longitudinal observational. So basically, we're following 250 people that are going through the New York State Cannabis Program and observing incredibly closely, right? And observing incredibly closely means 7 in-person visits, 39 web-based surveys, really monitoring the impact that cannabis will have on their opioid use and on their pain. And just, you know, so pleased to be a part of a study like that, which there aren't enough. We need to multiply that times 100 to really grasp this plant and understand it better. But amazing the insights that will be gleaned. And just a reminder that while we've seen some lifting of DEA restrictions on manufacturers, these studies can take 3 years. So even if we lift those now, we could be 3 years from good answers. And then the other study that we're participating in is the relief trial. Both of these can be found on clinicaltrials.gov, which we're randomizing to a voucher, which allows us to work in this space. Again, an impossible space. Dr. Chinasso Cunningham had to think outside the box on a protocol for this study. And we're looking for the first time at one of our products, which is higher in THC, versus one that's a 1-to-1 THC to CBD, versus one that's higher in CBD, versus a placebo, and all double-blinded, so approximating the gold standard, which everyone is calling for in a real-life trial that's ongoing right now. We're recruiting, certainly looking for help in recruiting, and to get better answers, not only to an answer that we still don't know, what works best, a higher THC, a 1-to-1, a higher CBD, or placebo in chronic pain. And these are adults with moderate to severe pain that are on opioids. Which one might work best, or might reduce opioids, or might support the most, but also very closely regulated titration protocols. And that's a big thing that I'm excited about because, you know, truly with any substance, the dose is the poison. The dose makes the poison. And we've seen so many substances that came from natural sources prior, where we pull out a single constituent and we supersize it, and it results in harm long-term. One of our, I think, biggest concerns about this plant is that that might also follow that path. And I truly believe that it's through research that doors will be open to education to best use this plant. And also, I think anyone in the medical community is aware that it's through research that at some point we may get, and we will get someday, insurance coverage, and where we will get more widespread acceptance for this plant as a medicine.
Thank you for that. And I think we all geek out on cannabis research. So let's stay on this and go around the horn again, and stay with you, Dr. Dahmer, and go around. But what is your favorite cannabis research pearl?
Well, again, you're asking me to choose my favorite child. That's really, really unfair. I'm going to throw out 2 really quick. One, you know, the Bradford et al. Study looking at Medicare Part D and showing a decrease in 7 of 9 domains of pharmaceutical use. And, you know, I'm not one to throw out pharmaceuticals. As a physician, pharmaceuticals are my right hand. We are in an epidemic of polypharmacy. And for this amazing plant that could substitute multiple, there's tremendous potential. Research will get us to a point when, how, and with whom might that be utilized. But the Bradford study really showed that when this is an accessible option for patients, pharmaceutical use in multiple categories fell, and we will need a tool to combat polypharmacy in the future. The other, just looking at biphasic dosing, less is more, you know, and just again and again, where I see so many kind of areas in the United States where we're supersizing THC, and in part why I said it's my favorite cannabinoid. you got to be careful with THC too. We want to really use that lowest minimal dose whenever possible. And the studies support that, what we call a biphasic dose, that getting higher levels really can only increase the number of side effects. And coming back to the ECS, and Kasara, you did such a great job of kind of summing that up. We have so many other ways to engage that system in addition or congruent with phytocannabinoids, with the plant, that we should always utilize that in terms of consulting and working with the plant.
Great. Dr. Machowski.
Yeah, so for research pearls, I mean, for me, it's really all about the endocannabinoid system. So when it was reported that we have endocannabinoids and we make this entire system, that just changed the world for research in cannabis. And we, quickly the scientists went in and disrupted these systems and found that animals in which you perturb the endocannabinoid system have profound deficits and are very highly susceptible to diseases. So that's what really brought me into the fold, in that, seeing this compelling research that it's such a critically important role in humans. So it's not surprising now that cannabis or components of cannabis are influencing that in positive ways in disease states. So that's it for me.
Love it. Dr. Andre?
I will say that as a veterinarian, public health, so also the health of humans, has a close intersection because we live so closely with our animals, have them in our food supply. So public health, as well as translational medicine, is really an professional area of interest for me. So I'm actually going to put a post in the chat of an article that I really love. It's Cannabis, One Health, Veterinary Medicine. So cannabinoids' role in public health and translational medicine. So anything that's in that area is always the stuff that I grab onto. What do we need to be looking at as we cross species boundaries so that one can help the other?
Thanks, Kasara. Dr. Porodnik?
What I get fascinated with is how different everybody is. Due to their genetics, environment, the same dose of cannabis can put two separate people in completely different positions. So it's very important that we start with the low doses, as Dr. Dahmer has said, and work with each individual. There's no buy one, try one, with this doesn't work. Patients really, quote, play with the stuff to get their results and to feel better. So to me, it's so amazing that the same plant product can react so differently with each individual.
Thank you. And Dr. Shu?
Yeah, I think going back to the endocannabinoid system, it really is like just discovering the endocrine system and learning about hormones and the impact that they have in health and disease. For me, it's we're doing some research on horses and birds right now. So looking at the different species and seeing how cannabinoid therapeutics can benefit them and improve their life is such a fascinating area of research. So certainly the endocannabinoid system, and realizing that we're at the tip of a very large iceberg. It's an amazing time in our history, and look forward to the next 15, 20 years and seeing how we can improve the lives of these patients through our better understanding of the endocannabinoid system.
Thank you, Dr. Shu. I just want to direct everyone to the Q&A board. We are coming up on the hour. Unfortunately, we could do a 10-hour webinar on this if we really wanted to, but please direct your questions there so we don't lose it in the chat, and I promise you we'll get to them. My favorite clinical pearl, I have to talk about psychiatry and mental health, is that people with PTSD have a lower amount of endocannabinoids in their central nervous system compared to people who have suffered from trauma without an actual PTSD diagnosis and versus a control group. So this is showing, again, a structural difference in people suffering from particular mental health ailments. So we will certainly provide you with those as well that you can share with your docs. So the last section of today's webinar will go over our research and policy recommendations. For those of you who haven't downloaded the paper yet, we have all of these succinctly in the last section, so you can go through them. If you don't want to read the entirety of our 30-page paper, I don't know why you would not. Paul, talk to us about the difference between rescheduling versus descheduling and why this paper in particular supports descheduling cannabis.
So, in its wisdom, the government has kept cannabis on the Schedule 1, which is where it sits alongside with heroin, which is, you know, much more highly dangerous drug. And so we've, you know, in the industry and scientists for a long time have been lobbying for descheduling of cannabis. There's several reasons for this, but I think the most important one is scientific. There's no scientific evidence that supports a rationale for including cannabis in Schedule 1. We actually, NCIA published a little white policy paper on this topic as well, that if people want to check out on the NCIA website, it goes into a lot more detail. So the question is, you know, what should we do? The Biden administration, as far as I understand it, is really calling for more research. Well, how can we do more research if it's on Schedule 1? It's doing research is incredibly laborious. You have to go through the DEA and FDA, and it's, you know, that's why so little research is done. So they're calling for that and the potential of descheduling. Okay, maybe it still has some bad aspects, but let's lower it. But the thing is the science doesn't support that. You know, the safety profile of cannabis is quite incredible as a therapeutic. And if you compare it, of course, to things like alcohol, which is not descheduled, it's almost a joke. I mean, you know, alcohol causes so much health problems for so many people, and yet, you know, you can go, anyone who's 21 can go get it anywhere and drink as much as they want, you know, but yet cannabis is, you know, considered too dangerous. It's just the science doesn't support it. And, you know, we lobby hard for descheduling it, take it off the schedule, let people do research, create a National Cannabis Institute that funds research, fund it, so we can learn more about this important system. Right now, I feel like the government has its head in the ground.
Yes, absolutely. I see we have some questions that are coming in now. Let's start, and please keep them coming in. I think Brian's going to start directing some of the questions. But in the meantime, we have 10 minutes left. If anyone has some closing thoughts, I know we all are so passionate about this paper. I really encourage everyone to print it out. You can post it on community boards. You can show digital copies online, post it on social media, bring it to your doctor's office, whether or not they're a certified provider. This information, we really tried to make it a primer, so it's all available in one place. Go to Capitol Hill, lobby, show it to your local legislators, to your policymakers. We really made it as scientific as possible. We have an incredible list of works cited so people can learn more if they really want to. And with that being said, I'll kick it over to Dr. Lynn.
So for me, Paloma, just to kind of clarify, the question is, what is the actual?
Tell us, wrap it up. Tell us about this paper, what it meant to you, what people should do when they downloaded this paper, what you learned about writing it, anything you want to say.
Okay, well, I think the paper is great because it really condenses a lot of work in one space. We actually spent over a year working on it, and we actually really put a lot of effort to include everything. The fact, what is the good, what is the bad, what is the ugly? We really haven't found much ugly, but one of the nice things about this paper, it includes everything. And by presenting this argument, we're really trying to get descheduling so we can work with patients and get them the best healthcare possible. By really restricting everything, by having conditions that we know work and having to kind of skirt the issue. For example, Spectrum in New York is not a qualifying condition, but most of these kids have either IBS or they've been bullied. So they go as chronic pain or PTSD patients. It would be so nice if we could just take care of patients, do clinical work with these components and give it a chance. Now, it doesn't work for everybody. And that's one other thing that's important to mention is that there are a few situations that this is not the solution. Certain patients with genetic differences, they can use cannabis, and then there are times it will stop working for them. There are patients who are using inordinate amounts of cannabis for long times, and they end up with a hyperemesis, a vomiting solution, and the situation, and the solution for them is to stop cannabis. So I think it's really important that we look at the paper, factor everything in, and be able to move forward. And yeah, we're all a bunch of nerds, but we find it so incredibly interesting. And the fact that it works is pretty amazing.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you so much for all the work that you do. Over 500 medical cannabis patients in New York State. So thank you so much for that. Dr. Paul, to wrap it up.
You're muted, Paul.
Sorry, yeah, I was just answering one of the questions, sorry. Yeah, I mean, so my take home on this is really like the time for action is now. You know, we have to go out and, you know, lobby the government about descheduling and creating a rational, sensible policy, regulatory policy around cannabis. We're falling behind every other country on this. You know, our paper is really like a good summary of different aspects of cannabis that I hope will help guide potential regulators, for example, to understand that not to be afraid of this, that this is a safe medicine that needs to be explored further, but the only way it will be explored further is for the government to embrace it by descheduling and allowing research to be conducted. That's my take home.
Love it. And I love the nerd power from the attendees. I don't know how, I can't, yeah, Star Trek. Great, thank you for that, Paul. Dr. Dahmer, wrap it up for us.
Yeah, just I want to again thank everyone for this opportunity at NCIA just to share all the work that we did and we're incredibly passionate about. And you know, for me to wrap it up, it's again there's power in the people, right? And this is, I always say this in lectures that I give, that this is the first medication that's kind of available, and agree with Dr. Lynn that again this should be really up to the discretion of the provider, but it's in the medical community in this kind of odd corner, but it's there because people brought it to the table. Really amazes me that for the first time we're working with, and I call it a medicine, and I call it a medicine on a daily basis, but that wasn't brought through the usual channels, which, you know, is the pharmaceutical industry. And again, I have nothing against the pharmaceutical industry, but fascinating that people brought this to the table. And I think that we're at a point now where we should demand, there are estimates, you know, upwards of, right, $1 billion that's spent on studying the harm of this plant. And I sometimes say in lectures too, that there are few medicines that have been studied as much as cannabis, right? Or few plants especially have been studied as much as cannabis. We need to start demanding that these dollars are spent towards how can we, as a person, and that might be a person with chronic pain or ASD or fill in the blank with a condition, but as people better harness and have a good relationship with this plant. And I think that we should demand that from all of our legislators and programs to really devote time, money, remove obstacles, to better understand how we can create a positive relationship with this plant, avoid pitfalls that we've done in the past, like we have with the opium poppy and other examples of plant medicine, and demand that the dollars flow to establishing that good relationship and establishing access for those that are benefiting from it. And again, I think we wanted to get down on paper and something that could be shared, you know, our thoughts and this rich history, this rich pharmacopoeia that exists in this plant, these decisions in the past that were made not based on science, but based on politics or even racism, and to have an opportunity to not repeat that. Let's let science lead the way, and let's fund the science to give us best answers to our relationship with cannabis.
Thank you for that, Dr. Stephen. You can please share your 2 trials on ClinicalGov in the chat. That would be awesome. Dr. Andre, take us home, finish it up for us.
Thanks, Paloma. I will say to everyone, just maintain your curiosity. There is so much that we have yet to learn about endocannabinoid system, cannabis plant, how it affects the system, but also other systems in the body. But I think also as we learn to examine cannabis plant, this new system, it also is opening opportunities in things we haven't evaluated in a while, just new avenues of medicine all across the board. So as policymakers, as practitioners, as patients, or caregivers of patients, if you happen to have an animal patient you're thinking about, just continue to be curious and push for good, solid medicine and good, solid science. As a scientist and a practitioner, I just want to know, is this something that can benefit my patients? Then I want to be there and make sure that I know the most about it that I can. So let's change the world. We already see it changing dramatically. And I think endocannabinoids
Did we lose Dr. Andre?
I think we might have lost her right at the crescendo.
Okay, we'll pick it back up when she gets on. But last but not least, excuse me. Final thoughts, Tim.
Yeah, I think she's back. Kasara,
Oh.
did you want to finish?
It was
You
the
were on
best
a
thing
roll
I've
there.
said in my entire career.
Yeah.
Stay curious. There's so much for us to learn here. We've only scratched the surface.
That's the second time today it's cut off a panelist in the final thought. So I apologize about that, Kasara, but thank you so much. Yeah, let's go on to Tim.
Yeah, echoing a lot of the sentiments that have been previously expressed, just seeing where the veterinary community has been for the past 6 years and where it is now, it was never a top-down movement. It was always bottom up. And so what I mean by that was that it was never the veterinarians going to the clients and saying, have you thought about this? Have you looked into cannabinoid therapeutics? It was constantly, every single day, the clients going to their veterinarians and saying, this is what I've been hearing about cannabinoid therapeutics. Is this something that could be beneficial for my pet? And as scientists, researchers, doctors, we really have a moral and ethical obligation to explore all potential therapeutic avenues. If we don't, then we're really doing a disservice. And as patients and as clients, we really have a moral and ethical obligation to ask those questions to see if there are potential therapeutic avenues that could be beneficial for ourselves or for our pets. And so, I'm really excited to see how far it's moved along. But there's a lot of times where I can't help but wonder if cannabis was never criminalized, how much further would be? How many millions of patients have suffered needlessly over the past 100 years? How much more could we be able to treat certain diseases like cancer? The amount of propaganda is still something that we need to be aware of every single day and work to reverse. I've talked to people whose parents are dying of cancer, and the propaganda and the stigma is so heavy with them that they would rather die than try cannabis. That's how severe it is, and that's how sad it is. So we still have a lot of work to do. Even though we're seeing rapid change, there's still a lot of work to do, and it involves every single person out there.
Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you, all of you, for writing this. I think we all really bonded over this paper, and it was a joy to do. I'd also really like to thank Andrew Klein, former director of public policy at NCIA, who really got all of us together to write this paper. Also, he's now at Perkins Coie, as well as Hannah Barker Mullen, who is paralegal, went over all of our citations for the paper. Last but not least, Alex Jones, who is an amazing copywriter. We're all doctors and scientists, not necessarily professional writers. So very grateful for her work on the paper. Incredibly grateful for NCIA, who really got this paper out. Thank you guys so much. I'm going to kick it back to Brian, and we look forward to hearing from you. Let us know what you think about the paper. Follow us on social, interact with us. Let us know if you have any questions, and we will all talk soon.